Hi, I'm Oliver, and I'll be presenting a work titled Comparison of Methods for Evaluating Complexity of Simplified Text among Deaf and Hard of Hearing Adults at Different Literacy Levels, which was done in collaboration with my colleagues Jessica Trussell, Becca Dingman, and Matt Huenerfauth. Automatic text simplification consists of computing techniques that aim to make text simpler, and there has been a lot of research into using it as a reading assistance tools for different user groups, including deaf and hard of hearing adults. Text simplification researchers typically need to evaluate if the output of their technologies is actually simpler using metrics such as comprehension questions or subjective judgments. But this evaluation can be challenging. For example, when using comprehension questions, the questions themselves may be too hard to understand. So even if the text is indeed simpler, the questions may not capture that. Another example is asking for subjective judgments that a reader with lower literacy may have a hard time providing. So the question is, can the metrics employed in prior work for evaluating simplified text be trusted to evaluate them with deaf or hard of hearing adults? So our research question in this study is, if we have texts that we know are at different levels of complexity, can a metric distinguish these different levels of complexity when evaluating those texts with deaf and hard of hearing readers? The metrics we evaluated included reading speed and comprehension questions. Now, our comprehension questions had a twist because we wrote two versions of each question that varied on their level of linguistic complexity. Each participant would only see one version of each question, which allowed us to determine whether varying the linguistic complexity of the questions themselves could affect their effectiveness. Our other metrics included participants' predictions of how well they had done on the comprehension questions and subjective judgments of readability and understandability. But how did our study work? To see if a metric can distinguish complexity levels, we first needed text that we trusted to be at different complexity levels. So we obtained text from Newsela, which provides different versions of the same article at different complexity levels. Participants would read one version of each article and then respond to the metrics in the previous slide. Our 54 participants also took a standardized literacy test, which allowed us to partition them into a higher literacy and lower literacy group so that we could analyze the results from each group separately. When analyzing the results from a particular metric, sometimes we would see that it was able to distinguish certain complexity levels at difference that we knew to be true, and this would suggest this metric works to evaluate complexity. However, other times we would see no differences, which would suggest this metric would not work. We investigated 6 metrics in our study, but in this talk I present the results from the best 2 metrics only. First, the results from the low-linguistic-complexity comprehension questions suggest that they could distinguish between the high and low complexity conditions among the group with lower literacy. However, these questions were not able to distinguish between the text complexity levels among the higher literacy group. Now, let's look at the results from the readability judgments. These were 5-point Likert scale items with responses going from strongly disagree to strongly agree to the statement, this text was easy to read. These were able to distinguish the high complexity condition from both the medium and the low complexity conditions among the lower literacy group, and it was also able to distinguish between the high and low complexity conditions among the higher literacy group. This was actually the only metric that was able to tell any differences between the texts with the higher literacy group. Our paper also presents the findings about whether the literacy level of participants influences their responses to these metrics. For instance, whether lower literacy participants tend to give lower overall response scores. We found that participant literacy affected responses for all of our metrics, and the paper gives more details about this. Now, this alone doesn't mean that a metric is good or bad, but it means that a researcher using one of these metrics should report the literacy levels of their participants so that the results can be compared to other studies in which participants may have differed. The key contributions from this work include methodological guidance for metrics that are effective for evaluating text complexity with deaf and hard of hearing readers at different literacy levels, as well as highlighting the importance of reporting participants' literacy levels when employing the metrics evaluated in this study. There are many limitations and avenues for future work outlined in our paper, but a key avenue for future work is studying whether we can evaluate other aspects of text simplification quality, such as grammatical correctness and meaning preservation with deaf and hard of hearing adults. We thank the National Science Foundation for supporting this work, and we'll be happy to address any questions. Thank you.